So, India and Canada are really pissed off with each other again.
The gloves are off between India and Canada. It's an unprecedented escalation. New Delhi has downgraded its relationship with Canada.
Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
India today issued a sharp rebuttal to Canada, rejecting allegations of its High Commissioner being a person of interest in a murder investigation, describing these allegations as preposterous imputations.
As the RCMP Commissioner stated earlier, they have and compelling evidence that agents of the government of India have engaged in, continue to engage in, activities that pose a significant threat to public safety.
In Canada, we feel that the Canadian politics has given space to a violent and extreme political opinions.
The phrase which came to my mind was actually a Hindi phrase, which was "Ulta chor kotwal ko dante."
Across the years, the relationship between the two countries has been full of upheavals. From warm diplomatic relations in 1947 to strained ties in the 1980s with a surge in popularity of the Khalistani movement in Canada. Remember, this was when current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the Canadian Prime Minister. Then, of course, the bombing of Air India Flight 182 or Kanishka by mostly Canadian Khalistani extremists in 1985. That led to a real worsening of relations. Relations that only thawed during Stephen Harper's regime as Canadian PM between 2006 and 2015. And 2015 was when Justin Trudeau took over as the Canadian PM. And soon, cracks began to form again in the relationship between the two countries. In 2018, Canada's parliament passed a motion recognizing the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in India as genocide. In 2020, Canada's support for the farmers' protest in India irked the Indian government. And finally, in 2022, the Trudeau government accused India of involvement in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Khalistani extremist, which is actually the issue that has escalated tensions between the two countries to unprecedented heights now. Most recently, Canada accused the Indian High Commissioner and other diplomats as persons of interest in the Nijjar murder probe. In retaliation, on Monday, India expelled 6 Canadian diplomats and recalled its High Commissioner in Canada. Trudeau's statements, meanwhile, have been seen as provocative, accusing India of quote-unquote denying, obfuscating and attacking him personally, among other things. They have also been called defensive. Now, Canada has been regularly accused of keeping the Nijjar murder probe opaque, especially to India. Trudeau has, however, said that all details of the murder investigation have been shared with Five Eyes, the powerful global alliance dating back to World War II, whose members are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And this is, of course, where things get geopolitically complex. You see, the US Department of Justice is executing its own probe of a plot to kill Gurpatwant Singh Panno, a Khalistani separatist who's been designated as a terrorist by India since 2020. Remember his viral audio clip full of threats last year?
Your destination is India. Leave Canada, go to India. Pro-Khalistan Sikhs have always been loyal to Canada.
So, yes, that. Now, India has extended its full cooperation with the US investigation, but then US on Wednesday went ahead and asked India to cooperate with Canada too on the Nijjar probe. Another player is, of course, China, widely accused of deep interference into Canada's political affairs. Trudeau's efforts to improve relations with China, contrasted with India's own precarious relations with its neighbor, is another important piece in this story. And then there is Canada itself, whose GDP is falling behind the US. In his country, Trudeau is trying very hard to garner support from allies, as just a year remains until the country's next national elections. And lastly, the Indo-Canadian trade. It grew from $6.8 billion in 2019 to $8.4 billion in 2023. Canada is the 18th largest foreign investing country into India. About 600 Canadian companies are present here. Canadian visas are in high demand. And Canadian pension funds account for 30% of all of Canada's investment into India. So how will all of this play into the very volatile India-Canada story? Well, listen on. It's Thursday. I'm your host Anirban Chowdhury, and this is the Morning Brief. First up, I speak to Harsh V Pant, Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. Professor, why don't you start by telling me about when the strains in the relationship first showed, which is during Pierre Trudeau's time?
See, it has been a roller coaster ride, if one can use, a flippant term for this relationship. But if you're looking in terms of just the dynamic of different political parties and different actors playing a role over the years, you do see a resonance of Trudeau and his legacy there, because Trudeau in some ways shaping the current state of this relationship. His father was part of the previous version, as you mentioned. So in some ways, I think two questions have been central in the past. One was the nuclear question, where the nuclear relationship between the two countries repeatedly came under a scanner. And of course, the other issue that you talk about is the Khalistani issue under Trudeau's father, also became a huge issue in the 1980s. So it's not new. It has been as part of Canada's body politic for a while. And just as Trudeau is playing a role today, his father had played a role in the past when he also refused to look at this issue as a very serious issue that could impact the future trajectory of India-Canada relationship, as it did eventually.
But the relations did thaw a little post 2006 to 2015 under Stephen Harper, right? Just to set the context.
Yeah. You are looking at, primarily in the case of the Khalistani issue, you're looking at the 1980s when you had huge episodes like the Kanishka bombing. But as you move forward, you also look at larger geopolitical convergence emerging and Cold War ending and, India and Canada not really being constrained by the Cold War logic, and both struggling to find some shape in the evolution of their political relationship. And when the Conservatives come under Stephen Harper, we see all of these issues being tackled. So, it took a Conservative Prime Minister, it took Stephen Harper, for example, to say that we will have a judicial inquiry of Kanishka bombings. And it took Stephen Harper to say that, look, we are willing to look beyond the nuclear question when he signed the Civil India nuclear deal in terms of redefining the very framework of nuclear engagement and Canada's willingness to start selling uranium to India after 1998's nuclear test. So I think on both these issues, Stephen Harper was very important. He played a very important role. He almost overturned decades-old policy response on both these critical issues. And it was under his leadership that India and Canada in 2015 signed the strategic partnership agreement when Modi visited Canada. And that was, again, a defining moment because the two countries defined themselves as strategic partners of each other.
And now again, the relationship is constantly worsening. And again, like you spoke about his father, Trudeau somehow seems to be the embodiment of India's allegations that Canada is not handling these extremist elements well at all. Like you said, you briefly touched upon how these domestic political conflicts, and by domestic, we both obviously mean issues that are, limited to within the country. These conflicts and altercations have had an impact on wider global geopolitical narratives also between India and Canada, especially there is the China question as well. Would you explain that to me, Professor, a little bit?
See, if you look at Canada's foreign policy broadly, Canada usually is a few years behind the US. US takes certain decisions and Canada takes a while to catch up. But the challenge there is that, as the other Western countries, as the other members of the G7, for example, have started quoting India or started having a much more robust relationship with India, Canada under Trudeau departed from that. And that, I think, their domestic politics became the primary reason why that happened. He felt that he needed to take the support or he needed to attract the support from some of the more extremist sections of the Sikh community. And then in that context, Trudeau could not separate his domestic politics from his foreign policy ambitions. And as a result, the decline in his relationship with India continued because he was so constrained by his domestic political compulsions. He just could not rise above them. And I think the result is what we are witnessing at the moment.
Despite all this, trade relations between Canada and India have consistently been improving, right? There is robust demand for Canadian visas in India. Both countries together invested close to 4 billion Canadian dollars in each other last year. Canadian pension funds continue to pour in money, although they are off their highs in 2020. Somehow, these things have been insulated from the political tensions between the two countries. But do you see them having an impact?
Well, I think so far, as you rightly say, they have been insulated, and I think all the boxes can be ticked, and one can make a credible argument that it has not been impacted. But the challenge, of course, is that once you have no one to tender to this relationship, it won't take much time before you also see the problems emerging in the trade and economic relationship. In the case of Canada, of course, there is a very strong people-to-people, dynamic here as well,
Right.
which continues to shape more than 1.6 million Indo-Canadians. It's such a big, huge Indo-Canadian diaspora. Their role and their ballast to the relationship continues to be huge. But what we are also, I think, starting to notice is how the diaspora is getting divided, that you do see the divisions within the diaspora on this question. You had, for example, targeting of an Indian origin MP who was suggesting that extremist groups are taking over the conversation, and he was targeted. So in that sense, I think we are also looking at the flux in the diaspora as well.
Right. But what about the 770,000 Sikh Canadians, some of whom also have concerns about Indian state interference?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think, we will have that the divisions within the diaspora will become much more evident, and will also in some ways reflect the political dynamic in Canada itself. I think we are going to see more of this fiction emerge, and this would be difficult to sort out, because it can exacerbate an already very fragile ecosystem, where certainly the differences between Sikh extremists and the rest that are becoming evident, but also in some ways the sense that Sikhs are being targeted. If this becomes the regular normative feature of the engagement, it does create its own sets of diplomatic complications for India in engaging with the diaspora much more comprehensively.
Next up, Pranab Dhal Samanta, Executive Editor Politics and guru of all things geopolitical at the Economic Times. So a lot has been said about Trudeau in India, more than Canada and India. And I'm going to come straight to the politics of it, and especially the larger geopolitical interplay, which you've also written about. So, between India, Canada, of course, but also India, US, India, China, Canada, China, and Canada, US. What do you think are the 3-4 things that are driving Justin Trudeau's motivations, if I may use the word, against India right now?
See, a couple of things, Anirban. Number one is that Justin Trudeau's own domestic political situation. He's the single largest party, but he doesn't have majority without support from other allies, which he constantly struggles to keep. He is under constant attack by the Conservatives over the elections in 2019 and 2021, where the Conservatives believe that they would have won many seats more had it not been for Chinese interference. The issue really blew up in Canada and led to the formation of the Foreign Interference Commission. Now, this commission did put out its initial report a few months back in May, where it singled out China as being the biggest sort of influencer, interferer in Canadian politics and electoral process, and it detailed how that goes about. Now, for Trudeau to show that he is battling this issue of foreign interference, for some reason, initially, there was this whole thing against China, but he seems to have desire to patch up, maybe for economic reasons. And even if you look at Trudeau's own politics in the past, has always been more ameliorative towards China. So he's trying to paint the devil on the back of India so that he doesn't, in my view, come under political attack for any rapprochement efforts with China. So drumming it up now serves him politically.
Can we say that Trudeau's accusations that are leveled on India, is that a sort of a subterfuge to deflect attention from, let's say, Canada's lack of success in handling China's interference in its politics and also forming a solid ally in the US?
Lack of success, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but definitely deflect the whole political argument of foreign interference from China to India. Because, see, that also electorally resonates given the Khalistan issue, the way it plays out in Canada. So he finds that that may be a better way to move ahead.
And also with elections coming up, is there a way to see his actions in another light as well? Given what you said, his failure to garner support, etc. Elections coming
yes,
up,
of course.
Coming up the next year. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see what happens is that on this Sikh Khalistan issue, the conservatives also, even though they were playing up China, that's not something on which they can come down hard on Trudeau. So he's trying to do a pushback and sort of build kind of image that he is standing up to India, and also that in his effort, the US is supporting him. That seems to be his political project, so that he is well positioned electorally by next year for another term, because that will make him one of the longest serving PMs of Canada.
Now let's talk about India and what it's doing. So it's come out strongly against Canada, really panned the comments, etc., for identifying Indian diplomats as persons of interest. But it's playing a very different game with the US. I mean, it has a very different stance with the US. It is absolutely cooperating with the US in its, examinations against, Sikh extremists. How do you see this whole balance between, worsening relationship with Canada and also its now strong, now fragile relationship with the US? How is India balancing the two?
See, there are two dimensions to this entire issue, Anirban. One is the intelligence/security dimension. Let's talk about that, which is a simple case of, was India trying to carry out an intelligence covert operation in the US, trying to get rid of some of the Sikh separatists who are there? If it is specific to that issue, there is a case which has been registered in a US court. The FBI is pursuing the matter. So cooperation on that subject, purely on merit, is needed. The difference is the US is not politicizing this issue. The US is not sort of drumming it up like Trudeau is. The US, in fact, is keeping that as a track which is open, while making progress on certain other aspects, more important, relevant aspects of the strategic relationship, which includes defense purchases, tech collaboration, Quad, all of that. So this is quite different from the way Trudeau is playing it. Firstly, according to what India says, no material has been shared with India like the way the US has shared. So we really don't know what to probe. Secondly, it is rather rich to say they can't, because the RCMP has a standing cooperation with the National Investigating Agency in India. It's an institutionalized cooperation. But all requests from India to Canada on issues relating to Sikh separatists have landed on deaf ears. Big difference is Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who is the issue in Canada, is quite different from Pannun, who is an activist in the US. Hardeep Singh Nijjar is a wanted terrorist in India. And his killing, for Trudeau to politicize it, conveys a totally different message. So whether you are allowing your soil to be used by people who can foment terrorist activity in India. Whereas with the US, it's a question of security cooperation, and it is being dealt with that way. Now, for what Trudeau is trying to do is he's trying to combine this security with the establishment in the US, which really wants to play up this issue, because there is a segment in the US which sees the Sikh separatists as some kind of an asset, intelligence asset. So trying to sort of combine with them using the Five Eyes platform to project that the US is with Canada on the issue. But he's doing so to meet his political ends. And I think the Indian endeavor with the US is this is not an honest conversation which Canada is trying to make with India, and to distinguish that from what the US wants with India. It's an ongoing conversation, but a lot will hinge on where this conversation goes.
So do you think US will, take it to the hilt as Canada has done?
So that depends a lot on how the domestic politics of the US plays out over the next few months. And the Canadian Liberals usually have better truck with the US Democrats. And there could be a more sympathetic ear from them, as opposed to maybe the Republicans. So that's a very interesting question, and we'll have to watch out. But I don't see the US taking it to the hilt. But they might look the other way if Trudeau is doing his politics, because they will see, if that helps Trudeau come to power, why not? I think what the question which will need to be addressed at some point is, what is Trudeau doing with China, and does that actually fit with US policies on China? I think that's a question which Washington hasn't looked at as closely, again, blindsided by this entire issue on Sikh separatists.
Understood. And lastly, on India-Canada, there is a clear demarcation between the political sort of scuffle that's going on, the altercation, the tensions, and the trade ties, which have not been impacted at all. How do you see this whole thing, panning out? Do you see one influencing the other? Because there are larger aspects of the relationship that both sides need to, look at.
So let's understand how India views this. India understands all of it, but has stayed away from anything provocative towards Trudeau. Now, this current round is a provocation from Canada. It can't be that other aspects of the relationship will not be affected if this continues to be the trend line. I think the Indian side doesn't want to do that. It has refrained from doing so. At which point India would want to say enough is enough, I think is something which is work in progress. But let's not forget, there was so much more which was to happen with Canada, particularly the free trade agreement. This just put on pause. It was moving in a very good direction. There were so many other things with Canada which could have been fructified, have not moved. And while you look at trade, also look at the trade with China. That's also booming. And now the Chinese want to repair it with the Canadians. So nobody wants to exactly rock that relationship except for Trudeau himself. Till what time will India tolerate that is point to be seen. But at the moment, I think the smart minds will say we should not get dragged too much into this mess. Don't make Canada about Trudeau just yet. So I think that's where we are. But if provocations continue of this sort, then if tomorrow they detain someone or arrest someone, then who knows what can happen.
And just as we were wrapping up production for this episode, came the latest twist in the tale. Testifying before the Foreign Interference Inquiry, Trudeau admitted that his government had no hard proof when it initially accused India of being involved in the Nijjar killing. Will this change things now between the two countries? Well, let's see. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. We hope you liked it. Please like, share, and subscribe if you did. A new episode of TMB drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Keep listening. Have a good remainder of the week. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.